Welcome to Tech Talks. I'm Holly Scott. I'm here at 160 Studios and have here zooming in to join me, Dave Kuraguntla, the founder and CEO of Aleo. Dave, so glad to have you here today.
Holly, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure indeed. I'm bullish about your journey for a few reasons. First of all, the technology and the space that you're in, chronic kidney disease, right now the focus of the organization is one that we have been watching and we understand to be one of the fastest growing and most underserved for many reasons. That patient population needs better solutions for chronic disease management, and that's heard loud and clear by patients and clinicians. And also the space in general in terms of better tools, remote patient monitoring, is expected to continue to be one of the highest of interest from a market sentiment and investment perspective for the next 5 to 10 years. So for our listeners, that creates opportunity. When you're thinking about your career, you want to stay close to trends of where there's clinical demand, clinical need, as well as investor interest and market sentiment. So we're thrilled for having you to share more about what you're doing in this particular space. And maybe we could take it from the beginning. I'd love to hear a little more about what brought you here. And if you don't mind going back even further than the day you came up with the idea, where did career become defined and entrepreneurship become on the radar for you? Was it in childhood? Was it where through your parents? Was it academics? I'd love to hear a little bit more about the road along the way here.
Absolutely. So I don't think my parents would have ever thought that I'd be doing what I do today. But I think if you ask me if you ask my co-founder, I think is probably the best person to ask this question. He would tell you I was probably the only 8-year-old that had religiously read every Fortune magazine that showed up in our mailbox every whatever it was, every week or every month. And so I think that was certainly maybe a inkling of what was interesting to me. But being the child of two immigrant parents, one that was a professor, and then one, my father was an anesthesiologist. I had a chance to, who did not believe in a babysitter. I got a chance to spend a lot of nights either in a on-call room or in just outside of a of a lecture hall. But the on-call room one was a little bit more of the more fun one, interestingly enough. I probably got a chance to just being in a hospital and knowing what was done there, and knowing that there was an opportunity when if your dad gets called into work, that you got a chance to make an impact, and typically a positive one in a life, which is really exciting. And I think the first time I walked into an OR, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, so pretty young. Probably can't do that anymore. But this was like the late '80s, early '90s, right? It was, yeah, those rules are different. But that being said, it was a really neat and awesome opportunity. I think even when I went into med school, and was having a chance to, very interested by surgery, very interested by the things that you got to do with your hands. It became an opportunity where I found myself getting drawn towards, was even just asking the scrub tech in terms of what are the tools. I mean, everybody else is worrying about the case anatomy. And I'm not saying that the part's not important. Please don't get me wrong. But I always thought the tools are really interesting. Why are they called what they're called? Who invented it? And I'd go up and everyone else would be reading up on the procedure, which certainly I did as well. But I'd be looking up, why is that tool that way? What was interesting about it? Why did they create it? And then certainly as I started to see different reps coming into the journey of, wow, there's this new technology that's in here and it completely is making XYZ easier or better or faster. That was a really very stimulating environment that way. And not just about what you could do for one patient, but maybe what you could really take your talents and skills to be able to do at scale, was what was really exciting about that journey from first walking into an OR as a kid to being able to think about how can you have that big impact on a large patient population.
Fascinating. So, jumping back to the 8-year-old reading Fortune magazines and jumping ahead to you cared about the patient, you were drawn to medical school. Did you know along the way that you didn't really want to practice medicine, that there was something entrepreneurial going on?
I thought the journey was, for when I even probably went to medical school, I thought that journey would include something outside of just being a surgeon, if you will. I think that was certainly the intent. I wasn't quite sure what it was. I think even my med school entrance essay was actually on. I'd worked for a good buddy of mine, local local retail politics, if you will. I think it was county council, and he was running for it. I remember just knocking on doors, and we whatever it was, a few thousand doors over a few weeks, and just getting a chance to interact with people. Healthcare was always one of the things they brought up, even in a local election, right? And I think from that perspective, realizing once again how important it was to people and how at the forefront of their minds it certainly is. But at the same time, I think there was a realization that that impact may not be felt very quickly. I probably was naive enough to not know how long the journey of a med tech company could be. But I think my med school essay was actually on being able to make an impact in patients' lives on a more frequent basis than you could in policy. But I think I knew that I wanted to do something beyond just that, whether it was going down towards a policy route or towards a leadership route in a hospital. I knew that there was going to be something else, but wasn't quite sure that this was what it turned out to be. But I think that was certainly a very interesting opportunity.
How'd you become involved with your co-founder? You mentioned your co-founder in the inception of Aleo.
Yeah, so it was a very thoughtful process of cultivating relationships, making sure that you've been through the hard stuff together. So we started off meeting on a Little League baseball team when, once again, I think I was 9, he was 10. And so our parents became friends. And that's ultimately what led to us being friends. So I don't think we really ever liked each other then or now. But it was really for our parents that we're sticking it through here. But it is kind of funny, obviously on an entrepreneurial journey, there's going to be highs and lows, and there's going to be tough times, and there's going to be, certainly some times when you're button heads. But it's still probably the easiest way to get out of a fight for us is the fact that one time we were in high school, we got into a silly fight over playing basketball, and we were at his house, and I was so mad at him, I told him to go home, and he kind of kindly pointed out that we literally were at his house, and so he was like, "I've got nowhere to go, buddy." So still today, that is the number one way we end a fight is someone tells the other person to go home, and it usually makes it pretty easy to laugh about it and recenter yourself. So I think it is very important to actually have that sort of relationship. Can get you through a lot of the highs and lows of the journey.
I absolutely love that example, and it's interesting because you come back to the home. Okay, I'm going to use this analogy for a minute because it carries a lot of weight in your example as well as in the broader scale. If you have the same home, if the same home that you share together is, in this case, the success of Aleo, that is where you come back to in those moments. We talk about radical candor in our organization, that if you don't have some level of healthy discussions that involve discourse and involve not always on the same page and not agreeing, then something's wrong. As long as you can come back to home, right? And home is why are we here? What's our intention? And we come back to the way we serve our industry. So I love that example. I think that's fantastic, and it really has an analogous way of in many relationships within business.
Indeed, for sure.
Yeah. So what was the inception of the market that you're addressing? I found your tagline fascinating, taking the Internet of Things and making it the Internet of the body. So did we find a software application first and then find kidney disease, or did we see the need in kidney disease and then determine that there was lacking tools in chronic management? How did this come about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think getting a chance to see the patient problem firsthand. And so my interest was in heading off towards a vascular surgery residency as I was coming out of med school. And that was an idea of being able to, obviously, a lot of new technologies, certainly in that field, certainly about 10 years ago as well, was certainly, I think, very exciting revolutions that were happening in terms of minimally invasive, moving from open procedures, obviously, to interventional ones. But along the way, realized we were leaving a lot of things inside the body and then waiting for patients to come back, right? Whether it was days, weeks, months later, they were going to come back and they were going to still have a problem. The underlying disease etiology hadn't necessarily gone away. We had just temporarily perhaps placated the problem, right? And so if we knew that the patients are going to come back and something's going to go wrong, it became a how do you solve effectively what is now a sampling error problem? And the answer was sensors and software, right? So started to look up what was out there, what had been done in history before. And that was a little bit of the genesis of the idea is how do you, quite frankly, reconnect the patient and the physician? And I think that was a really important part of that journey. We actually started off making a smart implantable in the bypass graft and stent space is actually where we started. And that allowed us to we learned a lot, I'll say, through that part of the journey. We actually self-funded the company. Had two co-founders at the beginning of Aleo, and they had a previous company in the wound care space. And so we had understood a little bit of, they'd understood a little bit of getting a technology into the hands of an acquirer. And I think this one we decided that starting with the patient rather than the technology was going to create a little bit of a different outcome. Not the last outcome wasn't positive, but that really, if we started there, we could really have the true North Star of what we were trying to accomplish. So we self-funded on the back of that for about 3 or 4 years or so, got ourselves to animal trials with effectively a smart stent and a smart bypass graft. But along the way, realized that we were going to be bringing a very different, quite frankly, a business model, not just a technology, but a business model, right? And that business model wasn't going to be built on selling a product. We were going to be providing a service, and that service was peace of mind for both the patient and the physician along the way. And I think that's been where we realized that we had to be in control of that entire journey and not just licensing our sensors onto other companies' very elegant, very useful hardware. But we also had to be a part of that whole journey. And I think classic pivot story. I think we had a couple months of cash in the bank. And one of our now board members, who's very involved in vascular access, Terry Litchfield, said to me, Dave, you cannot leave these patients behind, whatever you do. The need is too big. You've always had the patient at the heart of this, figure it out. And that's when we made the move to effectively spray painting sensors onto stents to actually developing a wearable on the outside of the body. One of our engineers came and said, look, I think we can do the same thing out there. And then we're very just responsive to the need. And so built out the wearable to not just get vascular access monitoring, but the ability to go after things like fluid status, become the world's first company to be able to do potassium non-invasively to where we're going next in terms of things like blood pressure, sodium, and others that we're excited to bring to market in the future as well.
That's fascinating. The complexity of what you're capturing cannot be really underemphasized, especially the potassium. I understand that to be a leading indicator of kidney health overall. And one of the big areas that that particular patient, especially in early disease stage, is required to monitor and titrate quite often in a vacuum, right? They take powders, medications, things to try to supplement what they're doing, but it's a guessing game.
Indeed, I think it's a very interesting how probably we don't think about the kidney enough, right? I think, just from the perspective of that journey, especially I think a lot of med tech, I think they're even in that journey in terms of the fact that there's 37 million chronic kidney disease patients here in the US, and probably 70-80% of them don't know if they even have it. I think it's not something that's in the public consciousness that much, but the fact that even some of our partners, one of them was the National Health Service out in the UK, we're sending nurses to patient homes to do a blood draw multiple times a week just to get hemoglobin hematocrit potassium. And so that became such a big, driver for them. If you can think about the what drives a hospital system to hire a few nurses, put them on a road, have them drive out to a patient home to do that, it must be a pretty big problem that they're trying to solve. And I think that is how can we make that scalable? How can we make that more efficient? How can we, once again, connect that patient and clinician and ultimately drive down that cost of care was really been a very useful North Star for us, and then led to, once again, that developing that technology. We knew that something could be done, and then we wanted to be able to push past that to something that hadn't been done before, and was our team up to the task, and they certainly were.
Yeah, in getting a little more granular on the tech itself in that journey, because I think it's important, especially when our audience is heavily made up of individuals who are entrepreneurs themselves or trying to chart their own road. Some people define success and it looks like this linear line, right? where the reality is what, like this and this and this, and dips around and goes up, and it's much more of a convoluted, complicated path. When you think about some of the headwinds, I mean, you started with a product that was invasive. You started, like I said, an entirely different business plan, and then shifting gears. What were some of those headwinds in the shift, as well as from an engineering perspective? That's also a different skill set. When you think about the person who understands the biocompatibility issues of something implanted versus a wearable, you're talking about a different talent pool. So I am curious on more about that journey from technical and team. How did you manage through that?
It hasn't been easy, that's for sure. I think from the perspective of being able to keep your North Star, I think, at Aleo, we talk a lot about the four Ps, right? So the patient, the physician, the provider, and the payer. If their interests are not aligned, I think it's really hard to make the impact that you want to have. You're gonna continue to hit a lot of resistance, right? And I think from that perspective, being able to know whether or not we were doing the right thing has always been at the forefront of our mind. Once again, to not get enamored with our own technology. I think being willing to put it in front of folks as well very quickly and get their feedback was very important as well. As I mentioned, when we made that pivot from an invasive product to a wearable, there was the opportunity. Initially, it was really around the vascular access component. And so it was really all the way at that, the narrow end of that funnel, if you will, from early kidney disease to late. Vascular access is a leading cause of cost of care, and making sure it stays open is certainly important, very valuable to the patient in terms of the fact that they know it's likely to get to go down at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But as we continue to have that conversation, especially 5 or 6 years ago, the reimbursement model wasn't there. It's a highly fragmented system in terms of vascular access monitoring was one component. Trying to manage your fluids through dialysis and your fluid status might have been done by the dialysis provider. The fact that you're managing your potassium might land you in a hospital was a whole different component as well, and that cost is being borne by somebody else in terms of that hospital provider. So it's a very highly fragmented system. So you got to make some bets, right? I think the two bets that we made was, one, that we knew there was a lot of need for new legislation. The fact that kidney care was coming into the public consciousness, and I think into the policy consciousness as well. So we saw that it was likely that the Advancing American Kidney Health Initiative was going to get brought in originally by executive order, and then by Congress as well. And so we knew that was going to make a big shift in that value-based care world. So we made a bet on that. So I think sometimes you do have to make some bets, and believe that it's going to change. Sure, we knew, okay, some of these things are still valuable for the heart failure patient, for the infusion patient in oncology. So there's certainly other disease states that, cancer is a big name, cardiac's a big name, but maybe if we could stay a little bit on the radar, focus on kidney where nobody else was. Let's take a small bet. We knew we could pivot away from kidney if we needed to,
Mm-hmm.
but we knew that there was a really distinct need where fluid status, potassium, and vascular access drives 80% of the hospitalizations and costs for these patients, especially that end stage component. So let's see if the policy comes to us while we're developing the technology. I think on the other side of that was making the bet on the technology side. So I mentioned the fact that the NHS was sending these nurses out to the patient homes. They're doing a point of care test, but that was obviously very expensive and cumbersome. So they put out a global RFP, and they basically said, is there anybody that can help us do both of these in a non-invasive, scalable manner? And so we lifted our hand up and we said, we can, but only one of the things that you care about right now in terms of hemoglobin hematocrit. And they said, okay, well, let's see if you guys are accurate in what you can do. We said, no one's ever done potassium ever before. We may not be able to do it either, but we can at least help you on this thing. Let's see where the journey takes us. And so we did. It was good. We showcased that we were comparable to a blood draw, which is ultimately what we ended up doing from a regulatory component. But then COVID hit. And so we were like, great. I think we were on the last flight out of England back to the US to be able to get that study done. But now it was, what are we going to do? We've got a whole bunch of data scientists that we're not feeding any more clinical data to. It's right at the early stages of COVID. But what we knew is that they had also been, when they were taking those blood draws to confirm H and H, they'd also, in their database, obviously had potassium because they needed it. So we basically said, is there a bet that we can make on ourselves? Once again, no one's ever done this, but let's try. We've got what do we have to lose right now? Either I'm going to have to make a hard decision and let a bunch of engineers and clinical people go, or we can make a fundamentally game-changing decision for patients and see if we can do it. Let's take the bet. Yes, it's a little bit more of burn right now, but let's go do it. And fundamentally, that was the right decision. The team was able to figure it out. A lot of folks, whether it was the board, whether it was our own engineers, whether it was, shareholders, nobody thought it could be done and was like, hey, it's COVID. We got to completely play this game differently, just commercialize off of, some of the basic vitals that you have. But we felt like, let's stick to our core, let's stick to what we're doing and see if we can't make a broader impact. And that was exciting to be able to do it.
And you did it. And you did it. Wow. Congratulations. That's interesting. I love hearing the components of the story, and it's in every successful journey where you did burn the boats. You said, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going for it. Let's not think about it anymore. Let's go forward and no doubt. Don't even let the shroud of doubt enter our brain and charter on. So, and here we are. And
Indeed.
here, so where are we commercially? Give us a little idea of where that journey has led, the timeline in terms of market penetration and adoption.
Absolutely. So from our perspective, we were able to get a clearance around your basic vitals a couple of years ago. But as I mentioned, that wasn't going to be enough. But it served as a way to get us comfortable with the FDA process, get us to effectively be our own predicate for when we brought hemoglobin hematocrit and potassium back in front of the agency, the ability to then add on our vascular access component as well of how we can let folks know whether there's flow or not inside of the blood vessel. And so I think that was something that was very valuable in that journey that led to us ultimately launching right at the turn of the year this past year. The interesting thing from an Aleo perspective is that as you go into those value-based care components, it really is an enterprise contract. It's very much a recurring revenue model. We also looked at it from the perspective of the fact that these patients are federally mandated to be monitored. So that's a little bit of a tailwind. The fact that there are a set of international guidelines around where to keep these patients between. So we didn't have to come up with a metric. We didn't have to come up with the guidelines and kind of the guardrails. And we didn't have to come up with a clinical workflow. The people knowing if it's above X, do A, if it's below Y, do B. So that allowed us to not have to necessarily face some of those headwinds. And what that has ultimately done is led us to several value-based contracts. Right now, we've done a slow launch, if you will, soft launch, slow launch, if you will, just to make sure what is that process? How are we building into those partners, making sure that we're doing a good job as we build up our inventory to continue to scale into those partners. Nice part is we don't have a whole bunch of sales reps out there that are necessarily having to knock on doors. We can go after a contract. We can think about it. Okay, they've got 10, 20,000, 30,000 patients for us over the next couple of years, and we can build into that segment. Once again, because we've been able to stay a little bit outside that, bring something novel. I think it certainly helps you from a market differentiation standpoint and stick in the brain, if you will, a little bit more clearly, which has been really valuable. So definitely early days, but from that perspective, excited about our early customers, our early partners who have been willing to go on the journey with us, helping us showcase value to them and to others as well. And it's been a very exciting turning point for the company.
Certainly. And the tailwind you mentioned, I'm interested in getting a little more information on. You said there's a federal mandate to manage this particular population. Is that indeed the case?
So exactly. So from the kidney disease population, you do actually typically that takes the form of a monthly blood draw right now. And so being able to get that same data completely non-invasively is certainly valuable. And I think that is at the same time for folks, it helps them understand, well, I know I need this data anyway. I have to get this data from somewhere. Maybe this is a way, once again, instead of getting a single snapshot once a month, I can now get a video. And as we think about things like AI and predictive and where that's going, you need that raw data set. And if you were going to build that predictive model off of only a single snapshot, you can do a reasonable job, but you're not going to do the best job and really meet those patients where they're at on a day-to-day basis, where you can start to potentially for lack of a
Mm-hmm.
better term, titrate their care
Mm-hmm.
to the right amount, titrate their drugs. I think that's where we're going to get to. But I think
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally you have to have that right database of data, understand how that patient is living and where they've been to be able to make sure you're putting them in the best spot moving forward as well. But
Mm-hmm.
not having to fight that do I need this data at all? And
Mm-hmm.
it's certainly a one less fight as you get out the door and start to talk to folks.
Yeah, in your, it's interesting that you mentioned early in career you had at least an interest in the policy side and following that area and following where market trends are going created awareness around this potential opportunity and allowed you to go down that road. Yeah, the sample, the blood draw it's an important component because whenever all of us go to our physician and they order a blood draw, you get results from that particular day, that particular morning, and whether you had a cheeseburger last night that makes your cholesterol higher, or whether you intentionally fasted and for the last 5 days you've been eating, or drinking smoothies, that can really impact what that blood looks like. And when you talk about, and Dave, you bring up an incredible example of why this is so important. When you have a better and more robust data set, when you have information that's getting more current and more viable and more robust information to the clinician, they're better able to navigate and stay ahead of potential issues before they have them. And when you're talking about the kidney population, you're talking about bridge to transplant. I mean, that's really where this goes. The end stage kidney disease typically goes to transplant. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that whole continuum, the better you can manage, the better you can stay ahead, that's got to dramatically improve outcomes.
Absolutely. That's where we want folks. We don't want folks to go to dialysis, right? That's where we don't want them to go. We want them to be able to, as you mentioned, get on that bridge to transplant, go in that direction. And the tough part about the kidney is as you lose those cells that do that hard job and those structures inside of the kidney that do that job of filtering both nutrients and waste, once you lose that capacity, it's lost, effectively almost forever, right? And so being able to delay that for as long as possible is obviously very important for the patient. Interestingly enough, once again, in that policy component, clinical teams are now incentivized to be able to bring that into in towards that transplant. So if you make that bridge transplant, there are incentives to do that, financial incentives to do as well. So I think once again, everything is now geared towards
Mm-hmm.
optimizing care
Mm-hmm.
and not just optimizing fee for service treatments, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important of how can you have to have the best data. We talk a lot about AI. Obviously, we leveraged it at a that distinct level of being able to take raw data and turn it into a novel metric no one had done before. I think we think a lot about it in terms of generative AI or predictive AI, but I think even if you want to get into that predictive and then ultimately the generative stuff, you have to start with a really strong fundamental base. You can't
Mm-hmm.
just start with a very sparse data set that does not understand where the patient's at to try and be predictive. You have to start with a very strong data set to help you get there. And I think that's what we've fundamentally understood. And I think we're seeing that already.
Mm-hmm.
There's differences in patients, right? There's, as you mentioned, it's a very interesting patient population where a lot of things change very quickly for them.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see that potassium build over maybe 48 or 72 hours. How does it work over that weekend or that long interval cycle? Some folks it comes back very quickly. Some folks it's very slow. So we're learning so much. There's going to be so many new things that we're able to see and the insights that we're able to get that I don't think people have even thought of yet
Mm-hmm.
that we're already starting to see in our data set, which is very exciting.
That is exciting. Yeah, because contrary to, say, cardiovascular disease, which the big heyday of cardiovascular disease, 80s, 90s, all the way to today, there's been a lot, thankfully, a lot of challenges that have been addressed and frankly fixed. A lot of plumbing and electrical challenges have been fixed in the houses, right? And then you look at neuro. We call neuro kind of the next frontier when it comes to intervention and what's going on there. But at the end of the day, kidney disease, with the size and the scope and the aging population of kidney disease, we are still in a market, in a world that's heavily relying on outpatient dialysis centers. Not only is that just an incredible burden on quality of life, but it's incredibly expensive. It's labor intensive. It's resource intensive. So your model of value it resonates, and it's also on so many levels incredibly important to consider, because what you're able to do with additional information is make better decisions around what the traditional path would be, and getting them into the care where, you don't go in cardiovascular care, your heart starts failing, it's surgery, you hopefully get fixed. With kidney disease, it's a progressive disease, and it just keeps getting more uncomfortable, a worse quality of life, and more expensive. And it's just a chronic failing condition. So this is an incredible area to tackle. And I think this is a huge and insightful one, but I'm also curious from where you sit, especially as you've tried many avenues and you're thinking about so many different potential opportunities here. Are there other applications downrange that might come into play, other diseases or other areas of healthcare that your tech might be indicated for?
Absolutely. So, from the standpoint of where we're at around kidney disease, you mentioned cardiac. I mean, the interplay between the cardiac and renal is very strong, right? I mean, cardiorenal is certainly there. Obviously, if your kidneys are functioning well, helping get the right amount of fluid in or out of your body, that's going to impact things like heart failure.
Sure.
Even if you look at managing that electrolyte like potassium, what's very interesting is there's a lot of recent articles that we're seeing that, interesting enough, hyperkalemia and that high potassium isn't just about whether or not your heart beats at the right rhythm or effectively AFib. It's actually even more tightly correlated with heart failure. So is it actually getting the right amount of fluid around your body, right? So that interplay between those two is very strong. So you've got to fix the plumbing, you've got to fix the electrical, but you've also got to fix, kind of the managing the waste cycle, if you will, of the house as well, and managing that heat pump basically inside of the house, right? And I think that's a very interesting aspect of that interplay. So I think as you drift towards that heart failure, we're already seeing these patients already not only have a kidney problem, but they already have a heart problem as well, and how physicians are able to help manage those patients better. I think also in terms of folks that are, for example, if you want to not only take care to that patient, but able to be more proactive about their home. I think we've seen a big gap between the stuff in your wrist and the stuff on the ICU. So anything that you want to do in chronic disease and bringing that ICU level quality care into the convenience of a wearable that doesn't need to be calibrated, that can just be worn like a Band-Aid, go about your day, doesn't require any interaction for the patient. I think that's very strong from the user experience component. So we're seeing a lot in terms of chronic disease where people are asking us for this. And I think that'll be great to see specialty infusion, for example, in oncology. And last but not least, I think some of the inbound's been around the virtual clinical trial component. Vitals are good, but being able to, as you know, that you've got a drug that may impact, once again, whether it's blood pressure or sodium or potassium, or the fluid status of the patient, you want to be able to, once again, if you don't have to send a nurse to the patient's home or require them to come in and drive somewhere to a blood draw, you can recruit these patients faster. You can get more interesting data. You can get alerted if something's going wrong a lot quicker, which I think leads to a much broader patient base as well, which is important for us, right? I think virtual clinical trials and democratizing clinical trials, if you will, means we get a better data set, and not just folks that can afford to go get a car ride or an Uber ride to to get that blood draw, or can get seen by a nurse, or now it can be anybody. And I think that's an opportunity as well as we think about how this continues to expand over the next few years. So starting in kidney, I think staying small, staying focused is obviously very important from a launch perspective. But we're already certainly getting a lot of inbound from other folks that can see value along the journey because of the market differentiation that we have.
I see huge opportunity in a couple of those areas, and thanks for bringing them up, because the tie and the relevance to heart failure and the growing patient population in heart failure creates a nice wave for us as we continue to look at both together and how they can best benefit from each other. That's a huge area for sure. I'm glad to see you're thinking about it. I'm also encouraged and would want to really confirm how important it is to stay focused on that clinical side, especially in the tech sector and the wearable side. There's been a lot of excitement about what can be, with an ambition that ends up shortcutting accuracy and clinical depth. And without that accuracy and clinical depth, you don't get the real clear value that you're going for. You can always come back for things that are more directed to a consumer, say. You can't come back and direct something to that patient and that clinician unless you really put in the work up front.
Absolutely. You have to be able to, when you're going through that process, I think not shying away from that clinical journey, that quality journey, that regulatory journey is important. I think we've been blessed to have a team that takes it seriously, that wants to set the bar high, that we weren't going to be close, that when we were doing this, we wanted to be comparable to your gold standard or your standard of care, and if we can beat the standard of care and be equivalent to your gold standard, that was the goal. It wasn't just good enough to be close, right? I think, as you mentioned, from that credibility standpoint, that's important, especially as you go out the door. Otherwise, you only get a couple shots sometimes, if maybe even just one. So it's important, I think, to make sure that you make that impact that you want to have.
Yeah, that's terrific. I appreciate that. So as we think about, any next steps, whether it's investors, strategics, pharmaceutical partners, how could someone get in touch if they're interested in finding out more about Alio?
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to reach out directly to me. It's Dave@alio.ai. So that's DAVE@ALIO.ai. So feel free to reach out directly, and happy to put you in touch with our team, talk about where we're headed, and why we're excited about the future.
We are excited to be your partner. We're thrilled to not only have you share with us today, but really help you build out the journey, because it's a need, and it's an amazing opportunity for patients, clinicians, and also those who are interested in building their career in a market that is expected to continue to have high demand for years to come. So, Dave, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's been a pleasure. I knew it would be fun, and it certainly has been. I'm really glad to have you.
Thanks so much again, Holly, for the opportunity, and thanks for the conversation. It's been great.
You got it. My pleasure. And to all of our audience, thank you for joining us on Tech Talks. We'll see you again soon.